this session, we'll be talking about less of technology-based solutions. We'll be going back to the roots. We'll be discussing what nature has to offer when it comes to solving climate change. We have here two distinguished people on this panel. We have Sophie. Sophie, hello. Sophie is here online, and Sophie is a futurist, and Sophie is a researcher and also co-founder of 1715 Labs. Together with Sophie, we have Keith Coleman, and Keith is a CEO and founder of an extremely interesting company, which is focusing on new ways of growing algae at scale. The company is called Suzvi, and you have some interesting progress, which we hopefully will be talking about. Sophie, you are a futurist. You're also working with big corporations. And can you please tell us a few of your insights when it comes to nature and farming? You're working with companies like John Deere. Tell us a few insights which you've learned so far, which you think we should be taking into account when we talk about nature-based solutions to climate change.
Great, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to come today to join this panel. So as you heard, I'm a futurist, and I advise John Deere, who make large manufacturing and agricultural equipment, as I'm sure you all know. And it's really exciting and interesting because we talk a lot about the future of food, the future of farming, and of course, sustainability and climate change. So it's a really interesting kind of question to get my head around. There was three things I wanted to talk about today on the panel. And the first relates, as it would do as a futurist, to technology. And what I really get excited about when I think about the role that technology can play in scaling some of these nature-based solutions is really down to the micro, which I'll start with. And the micro is about precision agriculture, or precision production of food. Now that we have sensors that can really look at the microbe or plant or soil level, whether that's drone sensors or all kinds of other sensors that are kind of exploding onto the scene now, we can really optimize every single seed in the field. And that's really exciting. And it's only exciting, of course, because the processing power or the machine learning is there to be able to throw some sort of brains at it. And if you could monitor individual fertilizer application, individual pesticide application to each plant, each seed, which most of the manufacturers are able to think about today, monitor them individually for disease or for harvest readiness, all of those things help the farmer, help the food producer to be able to optimize perhaps regenerative agriculture, which of course is something that is very important from a carbon sequestration and soil protection perspective. But it isn't just sensors on the field, so we're talking about sensors in beehives to prevent colony collapse disorder, sensors on fruit farm picking robots, sensors on satellites even observing fields from space. We're really creating what some people call computational agriculture, really that precision at the field level. And if we're able to zoom out then for my second point, we can think very carefully about the ability to be able to manage the entire food system, something we can't do today because the data or the different sort of departments of the food production system are so siloed. If we can use digital twins, and of course Keith uses these in his technology, which you'll hear about a little bit later on, if we could use a series of digital twins or simulations of various aspects of the food system, the siloed parts of agriculture, that help us to actively manage the food system, something that I think is super important for us to do. Could be model trade disputes, could be model environmental disasters, could be model, dare I say it, new pathogens, model supply chain failures, model cyber attacks. There are plenty of things that we need to be able to manage if we're going to have a resilient food system, if we're going to...
I fully agree. Let's zoom into one of them, one of those solutions. Keith, you tapping into the world's largest food source, and it's important for several reasons, and it's also to continue the conversation from the previous panel, it's one of the ways how to capture carbon. It's not just capturing carbon, it's solving several big issues. One of the biggest issues is that today, the world is feeding big fish with small fish. and your company is trying to bypass that. Can you tell us how you do it?
Okay, with a pleasure, thank you. Just to go back a step or two, algae produces 80% of the world's food, and yet we only grow about 30,000 tons of it a year, microalgae, and we grow about 3 billion tons of vascular plants a year. Vascular plants compared to algae are very inefficient. They photosynthesize and grow very, very slowly. They capture very little carbon, relatively speaking, and they're not very photosynthetically efficient. So if I take algae, 25 kilos of algae, a bag about this big, in 1 month I'll have 10 million tons of food, right? That's the amount of food which the Punjab grows in a year. So we are talking about an organism here that is productive on a different scale. And yet we as humans haven't figured out how to tap into that
Why
yet.
is that? What's so hard about farming algae?
So algae is hard to farm, A, because it's very small, B, because whenever we try and grow it, people have been farming algae now for about 60 years, but they make one fundamental mistake, is they don't really listen to nature, and they don't really go for nature-based systems. What they do is they take algae, and let's say they want a lipid-rich and oil-rich algae. They'll go to a collection of algae species in Maine, take an algae that might come from Norway, and then take it into a lab. They put it in, and they create an artificial growing system. They then say, well, that was great. It worked really well, and it's got all of the oils or the proteins that we want. They then take it out and put it into a bigger test tube in the Nevada desert, and this is a real example. And they then have to work incredibly hard to fight off all the other species, to chuck in all of the minerals and all of the salts and everything that an algae needs to grow. And what they've created is a very high-cost test tube. Right? We use a totally different principle. What we said is, we will scale down the ocean. So we only use indigenous species. So when we grow it in Morocco in the Sahara Desert, we go into the sea in Morocco, and we look for the species that does what we want it to do. There are 500,000 species of algae there. Why you would want to genetically modify one, I don't know. Why you'd want to take one from Norway to grow in Morocco, I don't know, because they're not adapted to do that. So we go into the sea in Morocco, we hunt for their species, and we've got 1,600 isolates, and we've narrowed it down to 12 that we really, really like and will do what we want. We then have developed a growing system that is 100% natural. Our name is Susewi, sun, sea, wind. We pump in ocean water, salt water, which very few algae farms do. We use shallow ponds, which sun shines in, and we use wind. We use natural carbon dioxide. We don't add minerals, we don't add carbon dioxide, we don't add anything. And so we've created a totally natural, scaled-down ocean where these algae can grow perfectly happily because that's what they're adapted to. Okay. And our system is incredibly fertile.
Okay, going back to Sophie's points on using technology to amplify the impact of the nature-based answers. Yeah. Are you using any advanced technology to farm algae? Are you using any AI, any sensors to make sure you can be well optimized for scale?
Absolutely. So algae have taken 3.5 billion years to evolve. And by the way, the air you breathe is a product of the algae because it produces 50% of the world's oxygen. But they are highly adapted, very sophisticated cells. And they can react to different conditions very quickly. Right? So when there's a lot of light, they produce pigments. When there's a lot of water and the conditions and a lot of minerals, they produce lots of proteins. So what we can do using space technology, we use satellite monitoring, we use IoT technology, is we monitor all of the environmental conditions and we monitor the algae's response to those environmental conditions. We don't try and manipulate the algae to force them to do what we want them to do. We look at how they respond. And using Internet of Things in our ponds, using satellite technology, we can watch the photosynthetic activity. There are satellites fly over our farms twice a day. We download the data to watch what happens, and we can see how they're responding to different stimuli. We can then work with the different stimuli to induce the response that we need in a perfectly natural way. And that's where some robotics come in. So we use AI, we use satellites, we use IoT, and we use robotics to operate a completely natural system.
Okay. Sophie, I want to ask you something around a topic which is connected to food safety. You know, we have these climate change events which are really changing the nature of humanity. We have forest fires, we have floods, and so on. How, in your opinion, as a futurist and researcher, we can use technology to better adapt to these future climate events?
I think it's a great point, and one I don't think is spoken about enough when we talk about the future of food. And that is the need to have resilient, not just plants, but also soil in the face of what will be, unfortunately, a very dramatic, I'm sure, climatic century. The IPCC, of course, talks about the fact that we're going to have, you know, once in a lifetime storms, whatever, every 10 years, every 5 years, you know, whatever that is. We need to therefore create production systems. We need to create seeds. We need to create supply chains that understand or take into account that those climatic events are going to happen, rather than just hope that they don't, and then of course fail. And there are a lot of technology ideas that you could think about in terms of making that happen, whether it's genetically modifying seeds, whether it's using data to find new seeds, seeds that apparently we only grow a very, very small percentage of edible foods in the world. You know, there are thousands and thousands of foods we could be growing, but we're not, because we tend to have monoculture. Having a diversity, I mean, like algae and many other things too, having a diversity of food sources is very important as we face, as I said, this uncertain climate. But I think one of the most important things that we need to think about is the fact, as I said, that there will be these events, whether that's floods or droughts or both at the same time, or fires or whatever it might be. We need to make sure that farmers and food producers and supply chains, the entire sort of conversation of agriculture, is resilient to these threats, and that's something that I'm very concerned about, and I talk a lot about with John Deere at the moment. There were these big storms last year called the Midwest derecho storms, which took out thousands of corn and soybean fields in the Midwest, and it was a huge event. And one of the reasons why some farms were able to survive is that they actually, their tractors used GPS to sow the seeds in the first place, so the tractors knew where to go in these destroyed fields. It was something that humans wouldn't have been able to do if they hadn't had GPS on board their tractors. So it's a seemingly minor piece of technology, but one that actually saved the harvest for quite a few farmers. So, you know, I'm imagining in the next few years, you know, lots of different innovations like that might make it easier for farmers to be able to create food in uncertain climatic times.
That's a good point. You know, one of the big issues which we have is over-fertilization. In farming algae, it's not really as big of a problem because you don't need that, which is the nice thing about farming algae. What kind of issues do you have when you want to scale up algae production into numbers which would change the needle in climate change?
Yeah. So we use natural inputs. We use sun, sea, and wind. So there's no scale issues in terms of inputs. We use desert land, so there's no scale issues in terms of desert land. We need desert land on a coast next to deep seawater. And so there's no scaling issue there. The scaling issues that we have to deal with are two. One is money, finance. So it's going to be expensive to build one of these systems. We've got 6,000 hectares of land in Morocco and 3,500 hectares of land in Oman already approved to build on. It's now a case of proving the scalability of the engineering. So, but we've kept the engineering incredibly simple.
Yeah.
So it becomes a question of getting the finance to scale up. And the second is the regulatory environment. So getting new foods to market. We're in this very strange situation. The world is desperate for new foods that are climate friendly. Our algae on your plate as a burger or a piece of Beyond Fish or something like that is carbon negative, right? But to get it approved for the use of that will take years, right? So the regulators haven't yet caught up with the need to accelerate the regulatory process to get carbon neutral foods onto your plate. So those are some of the issues that we've got to deal with. The other, of course, is scaling up this sort of technology in a desert, remote places, where you need a big building project.
Why do you build your projects in the desert and not in the ocean?
We can't harvest the algae that we need from the ocean, right? So what we need to do is take our algae, grow it in an exponential way in our system. So day one, without going through the whole growing process, day one we've got algae in a test tube. It eats all the minerals, it photosynthesizes, it divides. On day two we add more water, and it eats the minerals which are in that water. So as you go through 30 cell divisions, you go from a test tube to 12,000 cubic meter ponds, right? So we then have to build these ponds, and the last stage of the pond is a harvesting system where we harvest the algae over very simple screens, and we harvest out the algae product. And that's why we do it on land. So essentially, you're taking it through an exponential growth process and then taking out the algae, and you send oxygen-rich, nutrient-deplete water back into the ocean that is low acidity, and that is good. In fact, it's lower acidity, pre-industrial level acidity. So we're building it on land because that's where we can do it.
Okay. Sophie, in your perspective as a futurist, what other solutions do you see which we can take from nature and use technologies to scale up beyond just farming algae?
Sure. Well, the most obvious one is soil, and we would have, of course, heard a little bit about this had Andy Cato joined us, because he's really a pioneer in this. But the majority, particularly on the carbon front, of the kind of focus, particularly in agriculture, from a nature-based perspective, is basically putting our soils back together. We've essentially degraded most agricultural land, sadly, over the last, 200 years. A lot of the good stuff blows away because of wind erosion, monoculture, all that kind of stuff. And it's huge impact economically, really quite bad for all of us. And so a lot of these sort of progressive farmers, progressive agri-tech folk are looking at ways to put the sort of soil back on the agenda. And that isn't just from a nutrition perspective. As I said, it's also from a carbon perspective. It's keeping what carbon there already is into the soil and keeping it there, but it's also sequestering additional. And that's really one of the unique opportunities of agriculture, is that it isn't just an industry that can get to net zero. It actually could contribute to drawdown. It could, if you could farm land regeneratively, as it's called, then it could actually be something that can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are some fairly non-tech ways to do that. Not ploughing, for example, is a fairly obvious one. Planting cover crops in between each of your harvests is another way to do it. Those things are things that have been done for millennia. That's not modern technology. But certainly the ability to track that sort of thing from space, the ability to use very fancy new machinery, as I said, from a very precision optimized perspective, I think is really important. And of course, you mentioned fertilizers just now. John Deere has a see and spray program, which as I mentioned earlier, is incredibly precise, is able to spray each individual seed with exactly how much fertilizer it needs, exactly how much pesticide it needs. And of course, the outcome being that it dramatically reduces the amount of highly polluting and highly carbon intensive nitrogen fertilizer. And that's incredibly important as it pollutes our rivers and lots of other things. And as I said, it's very carbon intensive to make. So I would say that the soil is probably the biggest one when it comes to nature based ways to solve these sorts of questions, but of course there are many others, algae, etc.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Sophie. I would like to touch upon one more point, which is the supply chain. We already mentioned it several times here. You obviously want to supply a substitution of the existing food sources like fish. What is your feedback from the existing supply chain, and how open are they to the idea of using new products like algae in there for the customers?
That's a really good question. We get two responses. One is, we want it now. Please give it to us. It's carbon neutral. It's very, very high quality protein. It's 60–70% protein when we grow it. So please, can we have it? It's incredibly healthy stuff. The second response we get, and it's from the industrial players that we get this response, is, well, can you compete with fish meal? Can you compete with soya? And no, we're not prepared to pay you the carbon price included, right? So we can provide a carbon neutral food source but they can buy something cheaper and not have to pay for the carbon emissions. So they want us to compete on a full commodity basis. So there's a thing called least cost formulation, which figures out what is the lowest cost commodity that I can use to make a certain level of nutrition.
Yeah.
Right? And the least cost formulation model assumes that we are full scale, mature product. And so we have to compete with these. But there are lots of companies out there that want our product to produce new foods that skip the fish, that skip the meat, that are alternative protein products, or alternative oil products that can go direct to humans, and we're working with those. So we've got a very warm welcome. I think there's also some chemical products out there like beta-carotene, which we can substitute for in a completely natural way, and lots of companies are interested in talking to us about that.
Mm-hmm. And what's the quality of the alternatives compared to algae when it comes to beta-carotene, for example? Are you able to compete at the quality which they need?
So the beta-carotene market, I'm sure you didn't come here to learn about the beta-carotene market, but just to give you a sense, algae-based beta-carotene goes for around about $200,000 a ton, right? Ultra high cost, ultra high value stuff. Fungal-based beta-carotene goes for about $140,000 a ton, $110,000 a ton, and the chemical stuff goes for about $50,000 a ton. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't want to compete with the chemical stuff. It's a different market, but we can compete with the fungal and the algae stuff. So we make very, very ultra high quality beta-carotene that is in desperately short supply.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Sophie, when it comes to supply chain, in your big picture view, what do you think needs to happen at the supply chain level to make sure solutions like this, which are carbon neutral, maybe carbon negative, should be on the forefront?
But it's not a very futurist kind of answer, unfortunately. It's to me all about economics. It's about the full cost of certain things. I mean, there's no way that Keith's work can be deemed to be cheaper if you were actually costing every element of the impact of a competitor on the environment or on our future generations or whatever else. But that's just the way that we've inherited this sort of economic system and the way that we count the cost of things and the way that we say that certain things are cheap and certain things are expensive. I think there needs to be huge innovation in the way that we price stuff. And you know, I talked earlier about digital twins and simulations. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to put a proper price on the cost of food or on the cost of agriculture. I mean, conventional agriculture is creating huge environmental debt in the future. You know, the more nitrates we put on the soil, you know, the more we let the topsoil blow away. You know, all those sorts of things are just creating and storing up huge problems for us in the future. There's no way that low-cost solutions are really low cost. And I think that's, I'm sure, Keith's point as well. And so I think we need to think very differently about how we model what the cost of all these sorts of things are. And I believe, again, the only way we can do that is with technology. Our small, wet, organic brains are too kind of, I don't know, not capable to be able to do that kind of math and use that data to be able to make those sort of estimations. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we face.
Yes. Okay. Keith, you mentioned earlier that one of the big issues of your industry is funding, and your fundraising needs are probably quite high if you want to scale up the production. How open are the governments in supporting companies like yours? Are there any grant schemes available to companies like yours, or do you plan to fundraise only from private sources?
So in fact, the UK government has been very supportive of us. They funded the feed trials that we did, which were very successful. They also funded the development of the digital twin, which we built, which is a complete simulation of the entire ecosystem around us. And it can measure the inputs, the outputs, the carbon emissions, and so on. And they funded that as well. And they're funding at the moment what we call an AgriSat project, our satellite-based monitoring systems. And we won a £4 million grant from them, which was the largest grant that they gave to a private company in the last round.
Congrats.
So yeah, that was fantastic. So they've been really good. There are also European programs which you can go to, very difficult to get into, and it's multi-year application processes.
Yeah.
And then some of the global institutions like the Green Climate Fund are a bit difficult to get access to. The World Bank have funds, but generally don't support earlier innovators. They're not risk-taking organizations. And so for a lot of the funds, you do need to go to the private sector. But there's a lot of emerging interest, particularly in carbon plays, which we are. We started life as a means of capturing carbon, right? And we've looked at applications for what we can do with a product that captures carbon. So we're a carbon capturing system that can be used for food. And I think there's a fair amount of money now that is being mobilized to go after carbon plays.
So you're saying it's often very hard for you to tap into resources, even though your product is tapping into carbon capture. It produces oxygen when you're growing algae, and you're also replacing the food sources with something which we don't have enough of.
Yes.
Which is kind of a bad place to be when you need funding to scale up your operations. Yeah. Sophie, Keith mentions digital twins. What are your thoughts on this technology, and how do you think we can use as mankind the technology of digital twins for climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me it's one of the most important ways that we'll get to net zero is to use these sort of synthetic brains as our colleagues to help us understand the interconnectivity between all of the systems that we now rely on. If you think of the food system, it in itself is a very complex thing. It's everything from production and manufacturing all the way through to retail and distribution. But of course, there's a bigger question about how that food system sits within transport, within health, within global trade. All of those things are far too complex for any one human or even several human brains to be able to understand. And I believe the only way that we can do that is by creating simulations, sort of creating synthetic versions of each of those systems and then using them to sort of stress test against particular risks that we might be facing, particular outcomes that we want to understand. I talked earlier about modeling trade disputes. It would be quite useful to be able to do that and understand, or even wholesale gas prices. You know, what, as we're all experiencing at the moment, what impact will that have on the food supply chain, for example? Huge question that a lot of people are finding out in real time, which would be quite nice to be able to sort of simulate that in advance. And for me, this sort of emerging technology, this emerging digital twin technology, which again, you know, Keith is well on top of, is really interesting. And the interesting thing is, of course, when you connect Keith's digital twin to loads of other digital twins around the world and create, and don't judge me, terrible phrase, the Twinternet, once you can create those connected digital twins, that's when the magic starts to happen. You know, when you create, a bit like the early internet, you know, that Stanford was connected to Stanford or that MIT was connected to other people in MIT, but the power came, of course, when everyone was connected to everyone. And that will be the same, I think, with this digital twin as a tool. You know, it will be, hopefully, this ability to war game or stress test particular outcomes or, you know, as I said earlier, even new pandemics or whatever. And I think it's a really important tool against climate change or indeed any of the other risks that we face, you know, whether that's cyber attacks or you know, antimicrobial, any of those sorts of things.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing, Sophie. Keith, your vision is to build these farms. Are they limited to only places where there's plenty of sunlight, or what is your distribution strategy of building these farms?
Okay, thanks. Yes, so it's a photosynthetic activity, so you don't want to be putting one of these in London. You want to be out in the desert where the sun shines. There are 5 places on the planet which have better quality sunlight than anywhere else. Morocco is one, the Gulf states are other, Chile, Mexico, Namibia, and Australia. These are all places where you can have highly efficient photosynthetic conversion. You've got a lot of sun hitting the earth. So that's our main target. We've identified 14,000 kilometers of coastline around the world where you could do this. We could draw down 500 million tons of carbon a year and offset a lot more by utilizing this technology fully. Our strategy is to license the technology out. We want to roll it out across the world as fast as possible. The Coca-Cola model, if you like, of the bottling operations, and make the technology available. And so what we want to do is develop a platform. We are developing a platform, which is an operating platform, a digital platform. We will find the algae locally, and we've designed a standardized module, which is an area like a farm, that you can build and operate a module at a time and just roll out modules. So we've got the package of technology which we're developing and concluding, which will be available in a few years to roll out across the world, and we hope to be able to scale that really fast. And that's where the finance kicks in as well.
Yes, thank you, Keith. I know that technologies like farming algae and seaweed has consequences far beyond our normal expectations. So, for example, there is a problem with livestock which produces methane, which is about 7 or 8% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a specific sort of red seaweed, which if we dry it and use it as a supplement for livestock, and we all need about 100 grams per cow per day, it can reduce the amount of methane produced by a cow by 80 to 90%. So the only solution to reducing methane of livestock is not just stopping to eat hamburgers, but these are the unintended consequences, which is always a good thing when it comes to solutions of nature. Algae is even more positive because you can grow so much of it very quickly. What is stopping other companies to come into this market? What are the main inhibitors? Why don't we see these companies in all countries where there is sunshine?
So I think it's mindset. And if there's one message I would leave with the room today, it's about how we think about solutions. I think that humans sometimes are quite arrogant. We look at nature and we think, we can improve on that, we can genetically modify it. Or this is what we need. We will distort nature, we will adapt nature to what we need, and not think about the consequences. I think that what we have learned the hard way is that we need to adapt ourselves to be more in sync with nature, to be more in harmony with nature, to think more sustainably. And that's a values question. That's about how do we think about what we do and the consequences of what we cause. And I believe that the way we came up with Susawi in the beginning was by thinking differently, by thinking from first principles. How do we grow algae in a way which maintains its benefits, that is in harmony with nature, but that still gives us what we need, right? And we did it through respecting nature. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the starting point. The starting point for anything to do with the sea or the earth or the air is to start with respect and to design what we need in a way that respects nature and works with it. Nature has the solution. Nature has lots of solutions. We need to look at it and learn and understand what nature has to offer, and then be a little bit humble in our approach, right? Not thinking, we can do better than nature does it. Nature's perfected a balance and a system that makes the world a happy place. When we come in and be arrogant, we start destroying that and tearing it apart. And that's what we're living with right now. So I really do want to appeal for people to consider how they think about the solution in the first place, right? And I think that's the most important lesson that any supply chain can learn about how to face this impending crisis.
I fully agree with this. Sophie, when we come to solutions of nature, obviously, we can't, it is too late now for us to just plant 2 billion trees and be done with it. Obviously, we need technology to amplify the power of nature. When we had a prep call, you mentioned an important element which we can tap into, which is technology of satellites and insights we can get from them. Can you share with us a few ideas how you think we can benefit from the satellite technology in order to get more insights and act on them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the main thing that, one of the many things that satellite imagery can do is help us plan where to put those 2 million trees or 2 billion trees, as your example. As you say, it's not okay just to go and throw the trees wherever we happen to have a spare acre or two. The point is to be quite strategic about it and try and figure out how can we do that? How can we have a mixed agroforestry piece where you have windbreaks of trees, but you also grow arable in between? It's very much easier to plan and do the sort of satellite observation with that as a toolkit. Yeah. And now, because like every other Moore's law conversation, now that technology is so cheap, you can get satellite, a bit like only the CIA could get a few years ago. That satellite observation and data is incredibly cheap and incredibly easy to get hold of. And of course, the machine learning to be able to annotate and label those images is also getting increasingly more effective. And so it's, to me, I see it like a colleague, like another part of the toolkit, plus drones, plus sensors on tractors, sensors in fields, sensors in beehives. It's every single layer of that observation universe that we're building that is the toolkit that the modern farmer will come to rely on. People sometimes say the farmer is the most important sensor on the farm, and I think to a degree that's absolutely true. They know exactly what that field will do in bad weather. They know what's wrong with that animal and it's that animal's family and that animal's ancestors, because they've been around them for so long. However, giving them the superpowers that technology can bring them, to be able to observe their farm from space, to be able to observe other people's farms from space, to be able to share knowledge with other farmers, all of those things I think are driven, starting from the satellite revolution, and I think it's a really important part of the future of farming.
That's a good point. Let's take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions to our speakers, raise your hand and we can take it. Over there.
Hi, Amanda Parks from Pangaea. This is a question for Keith, and I apologize, it might be a little bit niche for this forum, but I think it speaks to what we were talking about with enabling technology and sensing. But one of the problems with algae growth in terms of shallow ponds on land and making it kind of economically viable has been about kind of getting the density of growth in the culture and the quorum sensing that happens when light isn't able to penetrate the first layers. I'm just wondering, how have you solved this in terms of being able to have you adapted in some way to break the quorum sensing? Like you were saying AI, robotics, I'm sort of curious, like what's happening on that front in terms of light penetration?
Thank you. Keith?
Given the panel topic, my answer is very simple. Keep it natural. Just do it as it does in the ocean. So as algae expands and grows, give it more space. That's why our ponds get bigger and bigger and bigger. So just look at the natural system. The natural system has a certain amount of light penetration, a certain distribution of the algae within that, so it doesn't shade. We just keep it natural. Yes. So we can keep exponential growth going for 30 days at the same light levels from day 1 through day 30, which no other algae farms do because they create this very green soup. And people like that because it looks rich, you know what I mean? But actually we don't, because that's not what you see in nature. When you see that green, thick stuff in nature, it's dying, or it's producing something that's no good, right? That's not what we want. So we just keep it natural, and that's why we create, every 2 days, we add more water, and we increase the amount of space that's available to the algae. And that's why we go from a test tube on day 1 to a 12,000 cubic meter pond on day 30.
That's amazing. Thank you, Keith. 1 more question. We have 1 minute to go. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask anything. Sophie or Keith? If not, Sophie, I'd like to ask you, what are your maybe 1 or 2 key points which you would like to point out and have our audience remember from this panel?
I actually, am I allowed to ask a question? I want to ask a question of Keith. I was just wondering, Keith, on the carbon price, if there was a price on carbon or an increasing price on carbon, at some point, won't you become cheaper than the £50,000 a ton chemical alternative?
Yeah, we already are.
Utopian?
Yeah. So
Very good question.
Just to be clear on the economics, we've set our cost point as being able to be competitive with commodities. So that's our target, and we will get there.
And how far are you from there now?
We're not far, actually. Because all of our inputs are free, actually our variable costs are very low. So this is all in the CapEx. So it's the fully loaded cost, fully depreciated cost that we've got to look at. But on an operating cost, we're already competitive. Having said that, if we added the carbon price to the price of fish meal or anything else today, the price of those commodities will go up by 15%, at least 15%,
Okay.
and potentially 20%. So that's their competitive buffer, which we've got to play under, right? So we've got to be even more competitive by 15% to compete with a non-priced-in carbon.
Okay, cool. And on this note, I'd like to close this panel. Thank you so much to Sophie Heckford and Keith Coleman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.